Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story.
The first time Harlan Boss saw it, he thought it was a bird. He was walking the perimeter of the Ardenmore Colonial Cemetery just after sunrise, doing what he did every morning, checking the gate latch, pulling whatever weeds had pushed through the gravel paths overnight, making sure the place stayed decent. The cemetery sat at the edge of the colony's older district, surrounded by flat red land and low scrub brush. Two moons were still visible in the pale sky, fading as the sun climbed. It was a quiet place. It had always been a quiet place. Then he saw the shape near the far row of markers. Small, low to the ground, moving slowly but with clear purpose. He stopped walking. It was not a bird. It had wings, yes, folded tight against its body, but it had four legs too and a long tail that dragged slightly through the dust as it walked. Its scales caught the early light and threw back colors that did not quite settle on any single shade. Ash and copper, a little gold near the spine. It was carrying something in its mouth. A flower. Harlan stood still and watched. The creature walked the length of the back row, ignoring every marker it passed until it stopped at one near the eastern wall. It set the flower down at the base of the stone, then it sat. That was all. It just sat there, small and still, looking at the marker the way a person might look at something they had looked at 10,000 times before and still could not fully accept. Harlan waited for it to leave. It did not leave. He took a slow step forward. The creature turned its head and looked at him. Its eyes were amber, clear and deep, and there was something in them that made Harlan feel briefly like he was the one who did not belong here. He stopped moving. The creature looked away, back at the marker. After about an hour, he checked his timepiece twice, not quite believing it. The creature stood, stretched its wings once without opening them fully, and walked toward the cemetery wall. It climbed it easily, launched into the air with two beats of those folded wings, and disappeared over the scrubland to the south. Harlan walked to the marker. The stone was old. The cemetery had graves going back to the first colonial period, and this one was from the war years. He could tell by the style of the marker, plain and military, the kind the ranger units used. The inscription had weathered badly. He could make out a name barely, a rank, a date. The rest had been worn down by 30 years of red dust and dry wind. He looked at the flower. It was small and white with 6 petals and a dark center. He did not know the species offhand, but it looked like it had been picked fresh, still had morning damp on the petals. He came back the next morning. The creature was already there when he arrived. It was sitting in the same spot, and at its feet was a different flower this time, something bright orange, thin-stemmed, the kind that grew in the wetland basin 3 kilometers east of the colony. Harlan had walked that basin once. It was not an easy walk. He filed a report that afternoon. He was not sure who to address it to, so he sent it to the Colonial Research Outpost with a note that said something strange was happening at the cemetery and would someone with relevant expertise please come and have a look. He expected the report to disappear into an inbox somewhere and stay there. He did not expect Dr. Vera Solano to show up 4 days later with a field bag over her shoulder and a very focused expression on her face. She was not what Harlan pictured when he thought of a xenobiologist. He had expected someone more clinical, more detached. Vera was compact and direct, with dust already on her boots from the walk from the transit pad, and she asked him 3 questions before he had finished his greeting. How long had this been going on? Had anyone else observed it? And had anything at the cemetery changed recently? Harlan answered all 3 honestly. At least a month that he had seen, no one else that he knew of, and no, nothing had changed. The cemetery looked the same as it had for years. Vera nodded and asked him to take her there. They arrived just as the creature did. It came from the south again, low over the scrubland, wings working in slow, steady beats. It landed just inside the gate, walked the familiar path between the markers without pausing, and went to the same stone at the eastern wall. It set down a flower, purple this time, something Harlan had never seen before, and sat. Vera did not move. She stood just inside the gate and watched with the same stillness the creature brought to its vigil. After a few minutes she said, quietly, mostly to herself, "Verath, southern forest species, they're not supposed to come this far north." Harlan asked if that was significant. "The southern forests are nearly 200 kilometers from here," she said. "It's carrying flowers from biomes all across Ardenmore, different species every day. That takes planning or something like it." She watched the creature for the rest of its hour. When it left, she walked to the marker and crouched in front of it, studying the worn inscription. "Do you know whose grave this is?" she asked. "No," Harlan said. "I've been meaning to look it up, I just kept putting it off." Vera brushed dust from the stone. "We should find out," she said. The colonial archive was kept in a low building near the administrative center, and it smelled like old paper and recycled air. Most of its records had been digitized, but the war-era files were still patchy. Some units had lost their documentation entirely during the chaos of the Hollow War's final months, and what remained had been scanned unevenly, pages missing, timestamps wrong. Vera sat at a terminal for most of the morning. The name on the marker, once she and Harlan had cleaned it properly with water and a soft brush, read, Corporal Danny Ray's 3rd Ardenmoor Rangers, killed in action day 214. Below the rank and date, someone had added a second line in smaller letters, the kind a family or a unit sometimes requested. It said, "She did not leave anyone behind." That line stayed with Vera longer than she expected. The Hollow War had ended 31 years ago. It had lasted 6 years, and it had been fought across a dozen outer colony worlds, all of them targeted by the Sketh Dominion, a hive empire that operated on strict resource logic. The outer colonies had minerals and farmland the Sketh wanted. The humans living on them were, from the Sketh perspective, an inefficiency to be resolved. The 3rd Ardenmoor Rangers had been a ground unit, locally recruited, tasked with holding the Kale Pass during the war's final year. The pass was a narrow route through the highland ridge that separated the colony's northern settlements from the lowland Sketh staging grounds. If the pass fell, 3 settlements fell with it. The Rangers held it for 11 days without resupply, against a force that outnumbered them badly, until the ceasefire was signed on day 215. Danny Ray's died on day 214, one day before it ended. Vera read that line 3 times. She did not let herself feel it fully yet. There was more to find. She pulled the personnel file. Danny Ray's, born on Ardenmoor, 3rd-generation colonial. Parents were farmers in the southern lowlands. She had enlisted at 18, served 4 years before the Kale Pass action. Commendations for field medicine, navigation, and what the record listed as exceptional unit cohesion, which Vera understood to mean that people trusted her, followed her, stayed steady when she was nearby. No mention of a dragon anywhere in the file. Vera switched to the species database and searched for Verath. The entry was short. The Verath were a small winged reptilian species native to Ardenmoor's southern forest continent. Solitary, non-migratory, not known to interact significantly with other species. They were not social animals. They did not form packs or flocks. They lived alone, hunted alone, and according to the database, had no documented cases of cross-species bonding in any recorded observation. Lifespan up to 200 years. Vera leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 200 years, and the Hollow War had ended 31 years ago, which meant the dragon at the grave was nowhere near the end of its natural life. It had decades still ahead of it, and it had spent 31 of them already making that walk. She went back to the Rangers file and pulled the unit record for the Kale Pass defense. The names were all there. 22 soldiers went in, 14 came out. She ran through the names of the survivors, cross-referencing with the colony's current population records. Most had left Ardenmoor after the war. 2 were listed as deceased, 1 was still here. Aldrich Sousa, age 71, address in the colony's Elder District, 2 kilometers from the cemetery. Vera wrote the address on a notepad. She still used paper for things she did not want to lose, and closed the terminal. She found Harlan waiting outside on the steps, eating a protein bar and watching the sky. "Did you find anything?" he asked. "Her name was Danny Ray's," Vera said. "She was 24 when she died. She was a ranger, one of the ones who held the Kale Pass during the ceasefire push." She paused, one day before it ended. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "I knew the pass story. Everybody here knows it. I didn't know she was buried in my cemetery." "There's a survivor still in the colony," Vera said. "From her unit. I'm going to go speak to him." Harlan nodded slowly. "And the dragon?" "Verath," Vera said, "southern forest species, solitary, not supposed to bond with anything according to every piece of literature I can find." She looked out at the red plain beyond the colony buildings. "And yet." Harlan looked at the notepad in her hand. "You think he'll know something?" "I think if anything happened between Danny Ray's and a Verath dragon, it happened during those 11 days in the pass," Vera said. "And if it did, someone who was there would know." She left Harlan on the steps and walked toward the Elder District. The address led her to a small house at the end of a quiet road with a real garden in front, tended carefully, which was not common in a colony this dry. She knocked. The man who answered was tall even now, bent a little at the shoulder, leaning on a wooden cane. He had the look of someone who had been strong for a long time and still carried the shape of it. His eyes were dark and careful. "Aldrich Sousa," she said. Yes, he looked at her the way old soldiers sometimes looked at strangers, measuring, not hostile. "My name is Vera Solano. I'm a xenobiologist at the research outpost." She paused. "I want to ask you about Danny Reyes." Something changed in his face, not much but enough. He opened the door wider. "You had better come in," he said. Aldrich's house was full of things that had survived a long time. Old tools on a shelf. A worn rifle sling hung near the door, clean but not used. Photographs in plain frames, some people, some landscapes, a few that showed younger versions of a man she recognized from his bone structure as Aldrich himself, standing in places that looked dry and difficult and important. There were no war medals visible. Vera had noticed that veterans who displayed their medals were often the ones who had made peace with what they did. The ones who had not usually put the medals somewhere they did not have to see them every day. Aldrich made tea without asking if she wanted any, which she liked. He sat across from her at a small table, both hands around his cup, and waited. She told him about the dragon, about the daily visits, the flowers from different biomes, the 31 years she had calculated from the end of the war. She showed him the species entry on her field tablet. She told him the grave marker said Danny Reyes. He did not say anything for a while. "I wondered," he said finally, "where it went." Vera looked at him. "After the burial," Aldrich said, "the unit came back for the ceasefire ceremony and we were given leave to attend the burial. It was here on Ardenmoor where she was born. I saw it at the graveside." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I could not stay for the whole service. I left early. I did not see what happened after. I always assumed it went back to the forests eventually." "It never did," Vera said, "or if it did, it kept coming back." Aldrich nodded very slowly. He was looking at the table. "Tell me what happened in the past," Vera said, "with the dragon if you're willing." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he began. "Day 9 of the 11, he said. The forward observation post on the North Ridge had been hit twice already and they were using the ruins for cover. Danny was running a check of the position when she found it wedged behind a collapsed wall, one wing torn open by shrapnel, bleeding, small, the size of a large cat. It was trying to make itself invisible and failing. Most of the unit wanted to move on. They had no time, no supplies to spare, and a wounded creature was a noise risk. Danny said no. She did not argue about it or put it to a vote. She looked at the dragon, looked at her unit, and said, "This is our problem now." She used cloth from her own kit to pack the wing. She gave it part of her rations the next 2 nights. She did not name it. She did not treat it like a pet. She treated it like a patient, which was what it was, and it seemed to understand the difference. It stopped trying to flee, it let her work. By day 11 it was mobile again, still tender on the wing but moving. On the night between day 12 and day 13, it woke the entire unit. There had been a Sketh scouting party moving through the ridge rocks 30 meters from their position. Vera could not hear them coming. No one had. The dragon heard them. It did not make a loud noise, it did something low, a sound Aldrich said he felt more than heard, and every soldier in the unit woke up in time. They held the position, the scouts were turned back. On day 13, when the main line to the south broke and the extraction route was blocked, the dragon found the tunnel. It was an old mining access shaft, partially collapsed, barely usable. The dragon had been exploring the ridge in short flights since its wing healed enough, and it led Danny to the tunnel entrance in the dark, impatient, circling back to her when she moved too slowly. 14 soldiers went through that tunnel. On day 14, 3 were still behind when the Sketh reached the tunnel entrance. Danny held the entrance. She had a rifle and 2 sidearms and she used all of them for 4 minutes while the last 3 people she was responsible for went through. The tunnel came down behind them. Aldrich stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Vera did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and she understood that sometimes the only respectful response to a story like that was silence. "The dragon tried to go back in," Aldrich said. His voice was steady but his hands were not. "When we heard the collapse, it ran at the rubble and we had to pull it back. It took 3 of us." He paused. I think it understood what had happened, it just couldn't accept it. Vera thought about the cemetery, about the small creature sitting beside the stone every morning, still and patient, carrying flowers from the farthest reaches of the world just to lay them down. Neither could you, she said. Aldrich looked at her, his eyes were red at the edges but dry. No, he said, I never went to the grave, I could not make myself. He put his cup down. She saved my life, she saved 13 lives, and she died one day before it ended. He looked out the window at his garden. I always thought I should be the one sitting at that marker, he said, not a dragon. Vera said quietly, maybe it's been sitting there for both of you. Aldrich did not answer. But he did not look away from the window for a long time. Vera had not meant for the report to travel far. She had filed it through the standard research outpost channel, a preliminary behavioral observation, 9 pages with field notes attached. She had flagged it as unusual but not urgent. It was the kind of report that got read by 2 or 3 people in the xenobiology division, filed and referenced occasionally in academic papers. Instead, it reached the Galactic Compact's Cultural Observation Division inside 6 weeks. She found out when a compact transit vessel entered Ardenmoor's orbit and sent a landing request to the colonial administrator. Harlan called her before he called anyone else, which she appreciated. She was at the cemetery when he reached her. The dragon had just finished its visit and was lifting off to the south, and she listened to him explain the situation with a feeling that was equal parts curiosity and dread. The diplomat who came down was named Reth. He was Tharan, a species that ran tall and angular, built for efficiency in the way that their architecture was built for efficiency, with no wasted lines and no softness anywhere. The Tharan had been neutral during the Hollow War. They had watched from a careful distance and made no public statements about the outcome. They were known in the Compact as clear-headed, data-focused, and deeply skeptical of any species they classified as emotionally volatile. Humans were at the top of that list. Reth arrived at the cemetery the next morning with 2 staff members who waited at the gate while he walked in alone. He wore the Compact's standard observer gray and carried a recording device on his belt, though he did not turn it on immediately. He stood at the gate for a moment, looking at the rows of markers, and then looked at Vera. You are Dr. Solano, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said, and you are early. I was told the animal arrives at sunrise. It does, you have about 10 minutes. They waited, the red sky lightened. The scrubland was quiet and the air was cold the way frontier mornings always were, with a kind of clean edge to it that softened as the sun rose. Harlan had come too, standing to Vera's left, hands in his coat pockets, watching Reth the way he might watch an unfamiliar piece of equipment he did not entirely trust. The dragon arrived exactly when it always did. It came over the south wall, landed inside the gate, and walked the path between the markers without any acknowledgement of the 3 humans and 1 Tharan watching it. It carried a flower in its mouth, dark red with a long stem. It set the flower at the base of the marker. It sat. Reth watched the entire thing without speaking. The dragon was still and the cemetery was still, and for an hour the only sounds were wind and distant colony noise from the buildings beyond the wall. When the hour ended, the dragon stood, stretched, and left. Reth was quiet for a moment after it went. It comes every day, he said. Every day, Vera said, for at least 31 years based on what we know, possibly longer. The war ended 31 years ago. Yes. Another pause. The creature is not human, Reth said. He was still looking at the place where the dragon had been sitting. It has no social contract with the deceased, no cultural framework for mourning, no biological imperative that would explain this behavior. He turned to look at Vera. Why does it do this? Vera had been thinking about how to answer that question since Reth had first sent his notice of visit. She had considered a scientific answer attachment behavior, imprinting, associative memory. All of those were probably true on some level, but she did not think that was what Reth was actually asking. Because Danny was worth it, Vera said. Reth looked at her for a moment. She could not read his expression well. Tharan faces did not shift the same way human faces did, but something in the angle of his head changed slightly. That is not a scientific answer, he said. No, she agreed, but I think it's the correct one. Reth looked back at the marker. The red flower was bright against the pale stone. My report to the Compact, he said slowly, concerns a reassessment of human species classification. There are members of the council who have found your preliminary report difficult to categorize. Harlan snorted quietly. Vera shot him a brief look. What classification are you reconsidering? She asked. High volatility, Reth said. It is the classification that has applied to your species since first contact. It denotes a species whose behavior becomes unpredictable under pressure. He paused. The council did not initially consider it a compliment. It isn't, Vera said. No, Reth was still studying the marker, but the council is now uncertain whether it is accurate. He turned to her. I would like to review the full military record of the unit that held this pass, the complete action logs, not the summary. Vera nodded. I can get you access. Good. He looked once more at the flower, sitting bright and still against the stone. A creature that learned something from one human, he said quietly, and has practiced it alone for 31 years. He turned and walked toward the gate. I want to understand what it learned, he said, and from whom. The records took 2 days to pull together. Vera had to request the full Kale Pass action logs from the compact military archive, which required Reth's observer credentials to unlock. He provided them without hesitation, which told her something about how seriously he was taking this. The archive sent back 43 files, field reports, medical logs, communication records, and a post-action analysis that had never been made public. It had been sealed under a routine classification and simply never unsealed. They read it in the archive room, side by side at adjacent terminals. Reth read the way his species did, fast and linear, very still, no visible reaction. Vera watched him more than she watched her own screen. The record was difficult, not because it was graphic, though some of it was, because it was specific. Names, times, decisions, the small precise details of what people chose to do when there was no good option left. On day 4, a soldier named Bevan gave his full ration allocation to the 2 most seriously wounded members of the unit. He did this for 6 days running, and when the medic found out and tried to stop him, he said he was not hungry. The medic noted in her log that this was not true. On day 7, the unit's medic, a woman named Aura, made 12 separate trips across an open section of the ridge under active sketh fire to pull wounded soldiers back to cover. The field report noted the distance was roughly 40 meters each way. The post-action analysis noted that the statistical probability of surviving 12 such crossings, given the fire conditions, was less than 11%. She survived all 12. On day 10, 2 soldiers, brothers named Dav and Saul, held a choke point alone for 19 hours after their section of the line collapsed. The unit needed the time to reposition. Dav and Saul did not ask for the assignment. They looked at each other and moved to the position without being told, and they held it until they were relieved at dawn. On day 14, Danny Reyes held the tunnel entrance for 4 minutes. Reth had been reading for nearly 2 hours when he stopped. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the screen, then he closed the files and turned to face Vera. I have studied 47 species since joining the Observer Division, he said. I have read military records from 9 of them, including Sketh Dominion records, which are the most thorough in the compact because the Sketh document everything. He paused. The Sketh post-war analysis of the Kale Pass action is in those files. Did you read it? Not yet, Vera said. He brought it up on his screen and turned it so she could see. The Sketh had their own name for the 3rd Rangers. It translated roughly as the unit that would not calculate. The post-war assessment described the Rangers as a force that had failed to respond to rational attrition modeling. By Sketh doctrine, when a unit suffered enough losses, it was expected to behave in predictable ways, fall back, negotiate, or collapse. The Rangers had done none of those things. The Sketh assessment concluded, this unit's cohesion did not degrade under pressure. It increased. We do not have a model for this. We recommend flagging human ground units as non-standard for attrition purposes. Vera read it twice. Non-standard, she said. It is the closest the Sketh come to admitting something frightened them, Reth said. He stood and walked to the small window at the end of the room. Outside, the colony went about its afternoon, dust in the air, people moving between buildings, an ordinary day. We have always classified humans as high volatility, Reth said. The assumption behind that classification is that emotional behavior is a form of instability, that a species driven by feeling is less predictable and therefore more dangerous than a species driven by logic. Vera waited. What this record shows, Reth said slowly, is that we were measuring the wrong thing. He turned from the window. Human behavior under pressure does not become erratic, it becomes concentrated. Every person in this unit, when the situation became worst, made choices that moved toward the people beside them, not away, toward. He looked at the closed files on his screen. Bevan gave away his food. Aura crossed open ground 12 times, two brothers held a position alone for 19 hours, and Danny Reyes stood at a tunnel entrance until it came down. He paused. None of them were ordered to, none of them calculated the odds and found them acceptable, they simply did not leave. The room was quiet. The dragon was there, Vera said. Yes, Reth said. It watched all of it. It watched her specifically for 14 days. It watched what she did and what the others did, and it learned something. He looked at Vera. And then it spent 31 years practicing what it learned, alone, without any of them, without any reason that my species would find logical. He picked up his recording device and finally turned it on. The compact classification does not account for this, he said quietly. High volatility describes chaos. What I am looking at in these records is not chaos. He looked at the screen one last time. It has a direction, he said. It always moves toward the people they love. Reth filed his report and left Ardenmoor 3 days later. He did not say goodbye to Vera exactly. Tharin did not do that, but he came to the archive room before his departure and left a copy of his report in her research file with a short note that said, "For your records, and because you should know what you started." She read the report that evening in her outpost quarters, with the 2 moons visible through the small window and the colony settling into its night sounds around her. The report was thorough and measured as she expected, but the conclusion surprised her with its directness. Reth had written, recommend reclassification of human species from high volatility to bonded persistent. The distinction is not semantic. High volatility implies chaos. What this case demonstrates is not chaos, it is consequence. Humans attach, they remember, and whatever they love they make impossible to forget even after they are gone. The Verath dragon is proof. It learned this behavior from one human during 14 days in a collapsing war. It has practiced that behavior alone for 31 years. This is not sentiment. It is the most durable force this division has documented in recorded compact history. She read that paragraph 4 times, then she put the report down and looked out at the moons for a while. In the weeks after Reth left, things changed quietly on Ardenmoor. Harlan submitted a formal request to have the grave marker restored and reinscribed. The Colonial Council approved it unanimously and faster than Harlan had expected, which told him the story had moved through the colony in the way stories sometimes did, quietly and completely, until everyone knew it without quite remembering how they had learned it. The stonemason who did the work refused payment. She said it was not that kind of job. The new marker was clean and clear. Full name, full rank, full service record condensed into 2 lines, and at the bottom, below the original inscription, a new line that the council had added at the request of the surviving rangers who could be reached, remembered by those she never left behind. On the morning the new marker was unveiled, Aldrich Sousa came to the cemetery for the first time. He stood at the back, away from the small group that had gathered, and Vera stood near him but said nothing. He was upright, cane in hand, and he looked at the marker from that distance for a long time without moving. His face was not easy to read. She did not try. When the small ceremony ended and the others drifted away, Aldrich walked to the grave alone. He stood there for a while, then he placed his hand briefly on the top of the stone and he walked back out without a word. Vera thought that might be the end of the story, or at least the end of her part in it. But on a morning 2 weeks later, she was sitting in the cemetery when the dragon arrived, and something was different. It came from the south as always, landing inside the gate, walking the path. But when it reached the marker and placed its flower, something pale and fragile, a species Vera did not recognize, with petals so white they were almost blue, it did not sit down immediately. It turned and looked at her. Vera had been watched by it before. It always noticed her presence, always confirmed she was not a threat, and then went back to its vigil. That was the pattern, that had been the pattern for 4 months. This time it kept looking. She did not move, she did not speak. She sat in the grass a few meters away and held as still as she could, the way you learn to hold still around animals that were deciding something. The dragon looked at her for a long moment, then it walked toward her. It stopped about half a meter away. It reached back and picked up something small from where it had been holding a second item against its chest with one folded wing, a habit Vera had not noticed before, and it set that second item down in the grass beside her hand. A flower, small and yellow with a dark center. She had seen that species growing in a wild patch on the colony's southern edge. She had looked it up once idly. It was not native to Ardenmoor. Someone had brought seeds from another world long ago. The flowers had naturalized in the dry soil at the colony's edge and just kept growing. The dragon looked at her for one more moment, then it walked back to the grave and sat, and the morning continued as it always had. Vera sat with the yellow flower in her hand for a long time after the dragon left. She was still sitting there when her research assistant called to check on her. She told him she was fine, she just needed a few more minutes. He asked if she had found anything new. No, she said, nothing new. She looked at the flower. Just confirmation, she said. She placed the yellow flower at the base of the marker, beside the one the dragon had left. 2 flowers side by side in the morning sun. The wind moved through the cemetery, slow and warm, and the red plains of Ardenmoor stretched out in every direction, quiet and vast, and somewhere to the south, a small winged creature was flying home through the open sky, the way it had done every day for 31 years and would do again tomorrow. Because some things once learned do not stop. Because some people leave marks that last longer than stone. Not even the ones she never knew were watching.